Hello, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive Live. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joined again. She cannot get enough of the live streams. Cathy Akratopoulos, our CEO. How are you doing? You all right?
I'm good, thank you, Chris. Excited to be back.
Yeah, it's really, really good to get you back on. And what we're going to talk about today, which we've been talking about. So, people who are watching this, you may or may not know, but at Lace, we are regularly asked to comment on a variety of different HR-related, people-related stories, newses, trends that are going on. And quite often we're featured in the press talking about some of those. Sometimes, though, we come across stories that we find quite interesting and feel like they're worth unpicking. And there was an article which we saw internally. I think it was featured on People Management or one of the HR press, and it was really focused around how to make Generation Z into great workers. Now, we're not just going to regurgitate the article today, Cathy, but what it did, I think, when we were talking about it internally was just get us starting to think around the fact that I think I've got some stats here, 27% of workers by 2025 are expected to make up from that Generation Z population. So I think it poses some questions that I think is worth us delving into today for chief people officers, for the workforce and how that changes. And also I want to touch on a little bit and what does career progression look like? Because I think some traditional kind of models as to, myself growing up maybe 20 years ago, how you expect it to progress, things are a little bit different now. So I think it's worth unpicking some of that. But should we start off by talking a little bit? Let's do a little bit of a framing around Generation Z. I mean, I've titled this but Leaders for Tomorrow, but maybe perhaps just talk our viewers through a little bit about what do we mean, and then we'll get into some of the detail around what that could mean for CPOs.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Absolutely. And as you say, there's been a few articles in the press over the last couple of weeks around this topic in particular. And so it may well be front of mind for some of our viewers. But what do we mean by Gen Z? So Gen Z is people born in the mid 90s through to the early 2010s. So they're typically now they're youngest in their mid-teens, and maybe in their for people who are at the end of that spectrum in their early 30s. So it's quite a range, but obviously they've been surpassed now with Gen Alpha as the new people coming through. But for us, we're looking at Gen Z because, as you say, the stats out there by 2025, 27% of the workforce. So actually, they're very prevalent now in our organisations, and if people therefore are either in their sort of later stages of education through to their early careers, or those people at the top end of that group are actually thinking about, they're at that stage of life in their early 30s, maybe thinking about settling down, getting a more permanent home, starting families and so on. So it's quite a range, but therefore, we have to think about what they've experienced in life to understand how they may operate in the workplace and the sorts of values that they hold dear to them. And I think that's the difference with these different generations, just understanding we're all one of those generations, right? In terms of, at some point we've been through life experiences that shape us, and therefore what is it that shaped the Gen Zs? So I think it's worth dwelling on that a little bit before we maybe think about actually what does that mean in terms of who they are and what they value and what they want from work. So if you want me to get into that a little bit first.
Cool. Do it. So go for it.
If we think about that group, then what have they experienced over the last 5-10 years? Well, they're the first digitally native group, right? So that means that they've grown up with the internet, and they're using smartphones and social media all the time, and that's pretty much all they've ever known. So it's their primary channel as how they access life in general, as well as potentially work. And they've got that immediacy of access to information and response to that information. So digitally native is one aspect. The other is that, they have experienced the pandemic at a very formative stage of their own personal development. So, they're going through the pandemic maybe in education or at the start of their careers. And they're also experiencing, economic downturn and cost of living pressures. So they can actually be categorized as people who maybe are feeling more financially insecure as a generation than maybe previous generations. And that affects, what they want from work and what they're looking for from their work community. And also as a result of the pandemic and the change in the way we operate, they're used to working at home more than ever as well. So actually being in the workplace maybe means different things for them, and they want different things from a work environment. So there's a few experience aspects that lead us to a load of sweeping generalizations, right, when we talk about Gen Z. So if we think about what those sweeping generalizations might be, and they are therefore very general, and don't necessarily aren't accurate for everyone, but the sorts of things, if you Googled it or asked AI to give you the answer of what a Gen Zer would be like, they're things like people are politically aware and active. They're maybe more socially responsible. They're more focused on the ESG agenda, maybe, and the ethics involved. They may be more inclusive and have certainly a passion for diversity. They're actually experiencing the highest levels of mental health conditions. And if you think at the stats around expressing stress and anxiety, they're probably claiming that they have the highest experience of stress and anxiety compared to other generations. And that's linked to that financial insecurity, workload, dealing with things like the pandemic, and sort of focusing on things like burnout, for example. And as a result, they've got a real focus on personal well-being. So actually, what I value is my personal well-being, and how does my employer therefore support that, and how do I prioritize my time to focus on personal well-being? And I think that sort of links to some of the aspects around financial insecurity. And there was a headline recently and the last couple of days about Gen Z home buyers having mortgage payments that double the previous generation. So actually, the cost of living, mortgage payments, and housing prices are such that it's far more difficult for a Gen Zer to get onto into the property ladder, and that brings financial pressure as well. But other generalizations would be things like they tend to be more open-minded, they're multitaskers, and compared to maybe millennials, they actually have a focus more on enjoyment from individual tasks rather than team tasks. But they're also looking for stability because of the challenges that they've been through. So that's my list of sweeping generalizations. But maybe we should get into what that might mean from a CPO or an HR leader point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And really focusing in, I guess, on this idea of the future skills, perhaps, that they need to be thinking about. So as a CPO, I'm thinking that that's going to make up a large amount of my workforce, or a big chunk of my workforce within the next year, within 5 years, 10 years, etc., etc. What are the types of things that CPOs need to be thinking about in terms of building these people up?
Yeah, exactly. And they will be the leaders of tomorrow, right? So and there'll be people managing Gen Alpha when they come in. Absolutely. So actually, what does that mean? And if we think about the way we we try and understand what people want from work, our approach to that is to think about the employee value proposition. And so from an HR leader point of view, how would you need to differentiate your employee value proposition to remain competitive as an employer of people from Gen Z as opposed to people from other demographic groups? Do you need to tailor your EVP? Are there elements that you would need to dial up or dial down to suit different demographics, just as you might look at your workforce by role or geography or business unit? Actually looking at it through generational and demographic data is really important as well. So I think that to me is the sort of the approach to this, is just understanding what makes people tick at different levels of your organization and from different backgrounds, and using that to influence your EVP language and offerings that you're providing to your workforce. But if we think about those sort of generalizations that I've just come up with that relate to Gen Z, what would that mean? And to your point, actually, from a career growth point of view, every generation wants career growth, right? Everyone wants to progress and be successful at work. But actually, what are the nuances for Gen Z? And so I think the nuances to me are more around actually thinking about it from less from a traditional progression of moving up through the ladder, and maybe thinking about it more from a skills perspective. And we've just got our Skills for Growth campaign running at the moment, and it talks about exactly this. How can you think about work from a skills point of view rather than maybe more traditional roles? There's been an article recently on some research that Robert Walters, a recruitment firm, did, talking about conscious unbossing. We love our catchphrases, right? Conscious unbossing, which is actually around Gen Z saying that they want to progress and they want to be successful, but that route to advancement needs to be more individual than assuming that they want to go through that sort of middle management layer. Do they want to manage others? Not necessarily, right? So actually, if you take a skills-based approach, that gives you far more flexibility about actually how you can progress, because you're building skills as opposed to aiming to get that next job at the next rung of the ladder. I think that for me is very relevant from a Gen Z point of view. But I think also, from an EVP perspective, we need to think about actually the values of the organization and how you embed those and how visible they are to people when they join. So, how strong is your ESG agenda? How strong is your D&I agenda? How visible is it? What are you doing from a climate action point of view, for example? How are you making a difference in society? Those elements are going to be resonating well with the Gen Z workforce. And obviously, as we said earlier, the focus on well-being is stronger than ever before, again, relevant to every generation, but individuals in Gen Z may well value that more when they're looking at their employment options, and will want their employer to help them understand how they will support their well-being in terms of achieving the right work-life balance, as well as things like health insurance and employee assistance. So we need to think about the well-being angle, and that so giving the flexibility works for them.
Yep, certainly. I'm just popping up on screen the skills campaign that we've got going on at the moment, which is you can find out more at lacepartners.co.uk/skills. Cathy, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been great to chat and chew the fat a little bit around the skills-based campaign. If you want to get in touch with us about the campaign, it's called Becoming Skills Powered. You can do so give me a call, drop me a line. It's chris@lacepartners.co.uk. But from myself and from Cathy, thank you very much. And we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.